The people standing here in line are not professional soldiers. Many are ordinary civilians. Yet they are all standing here to show one thing: that they themselves are ready to go to war against their greatest enemy. Because here, in South American Venezuela, a new war is emerging. A war against the greatest military power in the world, the United States. But what is actually going on here? Why is Venezuela preparing for an invasion by the United States into this Latin American country? How did things get to this point? And is this really the beginning of Donald Trump's first major war? The reason why, in recent weeks, more and more videos have been published showing armed Venezuelans in the streets of the capital, Caracas, is directly connected to an action by Donald Trump. It is, in fact, a response to America's operations off the country's coast. Because there, just about 2 months ago, the US Navy, on the orders of President Donald Trump, stationed a total of 9 different ships in the Caribbean. Among these ships are massive destroyers and even small aircraft carriers. For one nation to deploy such a large number of its most advanced attack vessels right off the coast of another country is highly unusual. And the US isn't doing this for a simple military exercise. This is more than just a threat. The Trump administration declared that the positioning of these ships served a very specific purpose: to attack Venezuela's drug cartels. In fact, Donald Trump himself directly addressed, in harsh words, all those who smuggle drugs into the United States. And he said, "To all those who smuggle poisonous drugs into the United States, we will exterminate you." In another interview, Trump made it clear that anyone transporting drugs that kill Americans will be hunted by the United States. So one might get the impression that Trump wants to use the military to stop international drug trafficking. At least that is the official explanation, and indeed several of the Navy destroyers have already directly attacked small drug smuggling boats coming from Venezuela. Not with gunfire or boarding, but with a ballistic MQ-9 Reaper drone. This drone, according to the US president, shredded the smuggler boat and everyone on board within seconds. Now, one might think that Trump is simply trying to crack down on drug smuggling from Venezuela with tough measures, but there's a big problem with that. The US government actually knows this. The main problem behind America's drug epidemic isn't the narcotics that arrive from Venezuela on small smuggling boats. Numerous experts explain that attacking these boats will barely affect the global drug trade into the United States. Most drugs come from Mexico, China, or other parts of South America. And the drug epidemic in American cities is mainly tied to synthetic substances like fentanyl, not to Venezuela's cartels. So placing nearly 10 of the US's most powerful warships off the Venezuelan coast is, in reality, not simply a counter-narcotics operation, but the US is pursuing something entirely different here. It's about Venezuela's president, Nicolás Maduro, and more precisely about the US wanting to overthrow him at any cost, much like they did with Saddam Hussein in Iraq or Panama's ruler Manuel Noriega. Just as Saddam's fall led to a bloody war and Noriega's capture turned into a devastating US military operation, it now seems that Venezuela could become the next target in America's next war. That Trump's government wants Nicolás Maduro dead is not just a mere assumption. The United States has even placed a bounty on his head, just as it once did with Saddam Hussein. The only difference is that Nicolás Maduro's bounty amounts to an incredible $50 million, the highest bounty ever issued by the US government. So the goal seems clear, but why actually? Who is Maduro in the first place, and how did he become America's #1 enemy? To understand that, we have to look at Venezuela's recent history. Venezuela is, in fact, an extremely rich country. It holds the largest oil reserves in the world, even more than Saudi Arabia. In theory, this oil could provide the nation with a thriving economy and its people with a good life. But that has never truly happened. But why? Well, in the 1980s and 1990s, Venezuela did indeed extract massive amounts of oil, but the profits went almost entirely to two groups. First, to American and European oil companies that struck deals with the Venezuelan government. These foreign corporations made enormous profits simply by extracting oil for the developing nation and providing the infrastructure. The other share of the oil billions went mainly to members of the government, which for a long time was deeply corrupt. So the people themselves hardly benefited from the nation's immense wealth. And so the people grew increasingly angry until they eventually brought the socialists to power. Under socialist leader Hugo Chavez, Venezuela took a completely different direction, suddenly becoming hostile toward the West and aligning itself with socialist regimes like those in Cuba, China, and North Korea. Chavez did, for a short time, make it possible for the oil billions to be used on a large scale for state support to the population. But that didn't last long. The socialist ruler made several disastrous mistakes. He nationalized the entire oil industry, expelling foreign companies and even Venezuelan specialists. As a result, the complex pumping systems and drilling rigs fell into disrepair, and the country's production dropped drastically. This trend continued in 2013 under Chavez's socialist successor, Nicolás Maduro, and in an alarming way. Eventually, Venezuela was producing only a fraction of the oil it once did, and the population fell into deep poverty. Money suddenly became almost worthless. People began looting, and Maduro established a kind of military dictatorship, trying to maintain his power only through violence. To this day, that has barely changed. But Venezuela's collapse, as just described, has also, and above all, to do with the United States. The policies of Barack Obama, and especially of Donald Trump, intensified Venezuela's downfall dramatically. From his first term, Trump ensured that Venezuela was cut off from global trade. Banks were even instructed not to process transactions with Venezuela. Oil tankers were banned from docking at US ports. And since America had for a long time been Venezuela's biggest oil customer, Trump's decisions caused the country's economy to crash even faster. It wasn't just Chavez's and Maduro's choices that destroyed the nation, it was also the US response to Maduro's provocations. Nicolás Maduro repeatedly denounced America as an imperialist enemy, while violently suppressing protests against him and increasingly turning himself into an autocratic ruler. In return, under Trump, America's rhetoric against Maduro became ever more extreme. While Maduro at times even sought dialogue with Trump, the US president portrayed the socialist as a far-left dictator.
Virtually everywhere socialism or communism has been tried, it has produced suffering, corruption, and decay.
And tightened sanctions against Venezuela even further. Which brings us to the present, and to Trump's latest move, one that could mark the beginning of a war. Recently, Trump began linking Maduro to the Tren de Aragua, a drug cartel that the US has labeled a terrorist organization. That alleged link, portraying Maduro as the leader of a terrorist group, would legally give Donald Trump the right to attack him directly. And in fact, the US president is already warning that military operations on Venezuelan soil may soon take place, officially targeting the Tren de Aragua, but unofficially aiming above all to overthrow Maduro. That is precisely why the dictator is now repeatedly mobilizing parts of the population publicly, preparing them for a fight against the United States. And if America truly launches a military first strike, it could mark the beginning of a new war. But let's zoom out for a moment. On one side, we have a socialist dictator who openly rails against the imperialist West and repeatedly threatens America. On the other side stands Trump, a president actively seeking regime change. Officially because there's a drug crisis that, according to him, Maduro himself is orchestrating to destroy America from within. But the true goal of this war will not be the fight against drugs, because a new government in the country could primarily make one thing possible again: US access to the largest oil reserves in the world. It would also put an end to Venezuela's ties with America's biggest adversaries: Russia, Iran, Cuba, and China, leaving the US without enemies in its immediate geographic neighborhood. But what do you think? What exactly is Trump planning with a military operation against Venezuela? And do you believe we're really about to see a war started by the US president who once called himself the President of Peace?